So yes, talk about accessibility. This is something that I had planned. Okay, I had planned to do to help Chris out with, but she was going to present it. But I do a lot of the accessibility checking in our tools in IBM that use the toolkit. So, all right, push the button. Here we go. So what I'm going to talk about is accessibility, why you need it. I'm guessing most people here will know that, so we'll try to get through that a little quickly because I think I've only got 20 minutes now. Talk a little bit about what DITA does automatically for you, what the toolkit is doing to enable accessibility. I'm going to focus on HTML and HTML-based outputs, meaning XHTML, EPUB, anything that bundles up the HTML files. And then try to tell you what you need to do on your own, if anything. So yeah, I'm the one talking because Chris isn't here, and I'm sorry you're going to see a lot of me today. So what do we mean when we talk about accessibility? We want to know if your content is available to everyone who is supposed to see it. Is it understandable? Can they actually figure out what you're trying to say? Can they use it once they have access to it? And can they use it on whatever device they need to use to access it, whether that's a tablet or a phone or a laptop or a screen reader? A lot of the features I'll talk about focus on sight, which is why I have the glasses here, but it's really regardless of any disabilities or impairments. So a quick quiz, is it important to be accessible? Raise your hand if yes. Okay, good, you got that one right. Why is it important? Well, if your goal is to reach an audience, presumably as big an audience as you want to get to, this is what helps you do that. And if somebody can't use their content, then they won't use your content. And they won't be your customer. And that means you're losing out forever. But if you need hard data, see I've got a chart here, so that means it's hard data. The World Health Organization says that, this is a study they did a few years back, over 1 billion people live with disabilities, and those are from extreme to lighthearted that just makes it hard to do something. And of course, as the population ages, that's getting bigger. And I've seen people point out in other accessibility talks that it's an interesting group to try to categorize because anybody can move into or out of this category at any time. And yeah, the hard numbers there, the print is even too small for me to read here, but I think I've got hard data, good data, squishy data, and I can't even read what the other one is. But that's important. Other business drivers for worrying about accessibility, well, if reaching people isn't enough, often your government requires it. There are federal government requirements in the US that for companies that don't provide accessible content, they just can't have the contracts with the government. That's kind of important. So the focus here is on WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is primarily for online content, trying to ensure that your content is available to everybody who's reading it over the web. So does DITA itself comply with WCAG? I've had people ask that, and I've had people say it does or it doesn't, and it's not really the right question. Because your DITA, if you have XML files, that's not what your customers are reading. It's being presented to them through a browser. So, or well, for the focus of this, through a browser. So your DITA editor probably needs to be accessible if your team or your people that you work with are using it, but that's outside of DITA. When DITA is rendered to somebody, they're getting HTML. It's the HTML that needs to be accessible. So DITA needs to have something to help you get there, or your tools need to help you get there. So that said, you can make your DITA content more or less accessible. So regardless of whether the content itself is written in DITA, is written in S1000D, is written in HTML, the content is the content. So if the content is bad, it's not going to be accessible. If good writing good, remember write good. If your stuff's written like that, it's not going to be accessible. Simply, people won't understand it. So write clearly, simple sentences, use consistent terminology that everybody else in your team or your industry is using. That helps with accessible content. But the focus here is beyond the quality of the text. What does DITA itself do for you? Well, web accessibility is very often concerned with making sure that whoever's looking at your content, however they're looking at it or hearing it, that they understand the semantic value of that information. If something that is bolded is a title and they're not actually seeing the bold, can they still identify it as a title? DITA is a semantic XML language, so those semantics are there in the tags. They just need to be conveyed to that screen reader in the proper way. So when preserving semantics, for example, the title, we put that in HTML as an H1 tag that bolds it. Browser makes it really nice and pretty. But there is other semantic information that can be provided to let the screen reader know this is a particular level of title, for example. In DITA, it's just a title. We have the H1, the H2, the H3. When you have tables in DITA, you mark something up with a header, and that says it's a header. You shouldn't have to do anything else to say that the entries in a particular column correspond with that bold thing up on top. And of course, we have alt text for images is one that most of you probably know about. Is anybody here not using alt text or not familiar with it, rather? No? Good. I phrased it that way so that even all the scared people wouldn't raise their hands. So give an example here, alternative text. The proper method to do it, it's an image tag. There's an alt tag inside where you can write a simple, short description, usually a few words or a sentence about what the image is. So that somebody with a screen reader, someone who's blind or simply not looking at the screen, can identify what the image is about. There's an alt element that was added, I believe, in DITA 1.1. Before that, it was an attribute that's now deprecated. New in DITA-OT 3.0, everybody should be excited about this. You can use your alt text with images. That was part of the DITA 1.3 spec. It was part of the 1.2 spec, sort of, but you had to use some creative interpretation. Whenever you resolve a key, very often those are for links. The link text goes along with the key. That's easy to understand. But what if your link text is carried through to an image? Well, the spec is clear now. That should become your alternate text. So if you have an image with a key, you can now put the alternate text together with the definition. That's supported in 3.0. It wasn't supported previously. So yeah, there's the little wiggly link text. What about really complex images? Does anybody think they could describe this road sign in 5 or 6 words, maybe even a whole sentence? No, I don't think so. If you could, I'm curious to hear what that sentence would be. But there is a Longdesc Ref, and that carries through to HTML. There's a Longdesc Ref that lets you link to another topic. And so you can have an alternate text, which the screen reader will say, you know, here's a very generic description of the image. It's rules of the road. But then there's an option to link off to a much longer description that can be an entire topic to describe this particular sign. You might need a whole topic. Tables and accessibility. Most tables can be automated with full accessibility with DITA 1.0. I want to be clear on that because there was a lot said about DITA 1.3 adding table accessibility, and a lot of people interpreted that to mean you couldn't do it before, which is wrong. It's wrong. For nearly every table, most of the common tables, all the tables that I've needed to support within IBM and all of our documentation could be supported with 1.0 level markup. You do that by semantically identifying your headers with T-head or ST-head for simple tables. And then for the header column, you can also identify that with an attribute. Really complex tables, those with 2 header columns or those with header cells scattered randomly throughout the table. I don't know how usable that is, but there are examples of how to do it. That markup is available in DITA 1.3. So, summary for your content, make sure it's well written, marked up properly, and don't forget that alternate text for your images. What does the toolkit do for you? Well, whenever there's semantic information in your DITA markup, preserve that through to the HTML markup. Headings are headings. We don't turn them into bold paragraphs and lose the semantics because that would be silly. Preserve things like alternate text and then use CSS rather than creative elements to try to style things. There's also, and I don't remember what release this was added in, 2.2, 2.3, ARIA role attributes. ARIA is a whole nother standard, it's another standard that is metadata within your HTML to say, this is a particular region of the page, this is the main part, this is a set of related navigation. It also on titles says, this is a particular title for this region of the page. It's all stuff that's hidden from you if you're just looking at the browser, but it's there under the covers, and we generate that. We do generate accessible versions of symbols as well. This was added in 2.5 at the request of Bob Johnson, who couldn't make it here, but he's talked a number of times at conferences about DITA and accessibility. The little caret, the right angle bracket that we use for the spacer between menu items, like file open, we now have the accessible text on top of that, so that your browser, or so that your screen reader doesn't read it as file right bracket open, which is not particularly helpful. And then the table headers. Those are, yeah. So table headers and accessibility, they're a mess. They always have been a mess. They've always been difficult. The old way to get it to work was to add a whole lot of metadata into your tables. Every entry had to have an attribute that told your browser, told your screen reader what header was associated with it, which meant we had to generate a whole lot of IDs for every header and generate a whole lot of headers attributes to say this is the header. We did that based on the semantic information in the DITA markup, so that in your DITA source, you didn't have to do that. You should generally never have to do that. So that's been automated and is still used for tables. It looked kind of like this, and it was messy. It made regression testing hard because you get all sorts of generated stuff in your files. You can see that's a lot of stuff just for a simple table. So the new way of doing it is with scopes and the TH, just making use of the TH headers in HTML. Back when we created Toolkit 1.0, some of this was sort of defined, but none of the screen readers we tested actually used it, which is why we had to generate those ID and headers. That's no longer the case. If you look around on the web for recommendations about table accessibility now, it says use this stuff, don't use the old ID and headers, it's a mess. So now, if you use a simple table, this is the kind of stuff that's generated. None of those are generated values, so they're going to stay the same every time you publish. It's scope equals column, scope equals row. It says this is the header for the row, this is the header for the column. And that will be coming in tables, I think, probably in 3.1. That's one thing that I had hoped to get in there for this release, but didn't make it for a couple of reasons. DITA 1.3 markup as well. DITA 1.3 does add the ability to let you control all of those things manually if you want to. Right now, we're not doing that. And again, I highly discourage people from trying to do it manually, except in those really weird edge cases. The table summary attribute is something that I hear questions about a lot. There is no dedicated DITA element that says summary, like HTML summary for a table. The summary is a way to provide a longer description of a table that doesn't show up in the browser, so that screen readers can get it where those looking at the browser do not. The desk element is there, and some people try to use that, but desk is really intended for display, the description, so it doesn't match the semantics exactly. The advice that I learned and that I heard given out to authors in IBM was write good captions that describe the table well, with additional description if necessary, and describe the table in your text so that people get the right information, they get the description of the table, and it doesn't matter whether they're using a screen reader or reading in the browser. Everybody gets the description. And when I've looked at various times, this has seemed in flux for HTML5. They called the summary attribute deprecated at one point, and then a lot of people complained, said, hey, we need that, and I'm not sure where it is right now. I wouldn't be surprised if DITA 2.0 added it, if it becomes, this is definitely HTML5, or if we sort of follow their pattern. PDF accessibility, I don't know a whole lot about it. I know it's really complicated. I know that if we need to retain information in the FO, we should do that, and then it's sort of up to FOP or Antenna House or XEP to make the PDF itself accessible. We don't have a dedicated resource on the team for this, again, a small team. I do a lot of validation of the HTML accessibility. I don't do that for PDF. When something is missing or broken, please report it to us. There are a couple of things open for accessibility, not much. I think they're all related to that DITA 1.3 stuff. And an example of some of these, we do have some issues fixed in 3.0 related to WCAG. Bob Johnson, again, opened up I think an issue that in WCAG 1.0, you could have a list of links at the end of your HTML file that were HTML div elements. WCAG 2.0 said if you're providing a list of links, you need to use list markup in HTML. So that switch is made in 3.0 for both HTML and XHTML. I will say going into the future, updates are more likely to HTML5 than to XHTML. in general, we're more likely to leave XHTML alone because it's basically stable. People have a lot of customizations of it. And certainly there's no XHTML development going on out there where there is HTML5 development in that standard. So whenever we have the complex table updates to use scope and column, I wouldn't be surprised if those changes only go into HTML5 and you keep getting the generated IDs in XHTML just because that's been working that way for so long. A few links, as usual, links to the web content accessibility guidelines. Now I'm ready for questions. I tried to rush through that because I know I was down to 20 minutes for that session. Questions?
Can you put the few links slide up during the questions?
Yes, but I'm gonna do it like this so that I can't let you take a picture because I know that's what you're gonna. No, sorry. Yeah, here's the main one. These slides are going to be posted, of course. The main links are just the regular DITA-OT ones, our Slack channel, our GitHub project, and then the link to my weird writings on DITA and DITA Open Toolkit. And then there's the WCAG guidelines itself. The first one is actually the WCAG overview with basically what this standard is, what it's trying to accomplish, as well as the rules themselves. And then the techniques. There's a lot of advice on how to meet the guidelines. Any other questions? Anybody ever have their customers coming after them for accessibility? I know we have. Elliot? Yep. Got a couple of hands. It may just be that, if you are not accessible, you just lose customers. Some of them will just go away. Some of them will complain. We've had some people complain in the past that things aren't accessible. Those usually result in pretty rapid fixes. I mean, that's a sign that something broken if it's not accessible, as far as we're concerned. Yes, Elliot.
Yeah, so my customer is a very large developer of database software. They were very, very concerned about accessibility because basically they couldn't sell to the U.S. government if they didn't meet accessibility for the documentation.
Yep. Yeah, and I'll just sort of repeat that by adding my own comment. Just like with your large developer, certainly within IBM, that's a very big concern. You can't sell to the U.S. government if you are not accessible, if your documentation is not accessible. The documentation for your product has to be accessible. Yes?
You seem to indicate that this only applies to various degrees of disablement. We're in the aviation space, especially cockpit applications, which seems to translate. I'm not saying we have disabled pilots in the cockpit, but more importantly, surely we're talking about the presentation, its ease of reading, ease of access.
Yeah.
Does the one translate into the other?
Yeah, so the question is basically highlighting that I was talking about the visual screen reader aspects mostly, but the presentation in general, is that important? Is that part of accessibility? And absolutely it is. If you have your titles coming out as the same font as your paragraph and the same size as your paragraph, people will miss the fact that you have an important title there. Yes, absolutely, the styling is just as critical in the browsers. I really focused on the screen reader aspect because most people, when they get started, most new authors I've seen coming in, they want to verify everything on the screen, and that's how they initially look at it. It's like, okay, we got to get that right. And so that is generally pretty well understood. If you can't look at the browser and see this is what my information is supposed to look like, the stuff that's highlighted is highlighted, if the UI is bad there, you have a problem. The screen reader stuff is so often hidden under the covers that people either don't know they have to look for it or don't know whether it's broken. So that's really the only reason I focused on that aspect. But yeah, I think even if you read in WCAG, they focus on font sizes, they focus on presentation of information, on what sort of CSS to use to highlight information. So yeah, definitely a critical aspect. And yeah, I would agree that the pilots probably don't need to be used. You probably don't have pilots who are using screen readers in the cockpit. Yeah. When I was showing this presentation to somebody in advance and getting a review, they saw my road sign sample, and their first thought was, why do you need to be able to have a long description of a complex road sign that the driver is going to read? It's like, no, chances are your driver is not going to be looking at a sign and needing to link to a long description because they can't see the sign. I really hope that's not the case anyway. You know, if that's the case, then I hope they are the backup driver and you're actually using a car that's driving for you. You know, one of those. But yes.
So I've been working on live data transforms since a couple of years.
Yes.
So I create, I can detect whether there's a screen reader in the browser and then run a different transform, which possibly makes stuff optimal for people with viewing disabilities. But then these kinds of rules and regulations, they will probably look at the regular website without a screen reader attached and then say, hey, this is not accessible. But then, you know, I'm adapting stuff. I'm presenting different pages to different audiences. How would that play with these guidelines?
Interesting question. I'll try to translate the question, pointing out that in Yong's case, there is sort of, I don't know if adaptive content is the right word here, but yeah, it's he can detect when a screen reader is in use and add a whole lot of additional, or you know, change the information, change something so that it works better, it's optimized for the screen reader, and not have that in the content that's presented without the screen reader. How do the guidelines work with that? And I'm not certain. I've encountered checklists and guidelines in the past that are at times somewhat arbitrary, and they say, you know, you have to have this here because the checklist says you have to have it, and you know, even regardless of any other circumstances. So if someone is evaluating you like that, you might be in trouble. If their hard checklist says the HTML you present to everybody has to have ARIA attributes, even if you know for certain no one's using them, you might be in trouble. You might have to generate them to comply. I could see that happening because I've run into checklists without flexibility. At the same time, you know, if you are able to accurately detect that, then you might be just fine. I mean, if the goal is to make the content accessible to everyone that needs it when they need it, and you're meeting that goal, then you're probably good.
Depends on how the validation, the testing.
It depends on how your validation is done, really. Yeah. I have a lot more experience with static content, or you know, even content that's refreshed really quickly and often, but it's the same HTML page, and then the optimization is done in the device based on how it's served up. So we try to put everything in the HTML that's needed, and it might be used, it might not. Any other questions? All right, I think that's it.
Thank you.